I wasn't looking for giants when I started this investigation. I was researching 19th century American archaeology, the mound builder controversies, the early days of the Smithsonian, the collision between science and spectacle in a country desperate to believe it had an ancient mythic past. That's where I was. That's what I thought I was studying. But then I found the Cardiff giant. October 1869, a farm in upstate New York. Workers digging a well strike something solid at 3 feet down. They brush the soil away. A 10-foot stone man stares back at them, weathered, heavy, apparently ancient. Crowds pour in. Scientists arrive. Newspapers erupt. Within 2 weeks, newspapers across America are running headlines about the discovery of a petrified prehistoric human. Theologians cite it as proof of the Nephilim. Geologists argue over its age. Thousands of people pay 50 cents, real money in 1869, just to stand in a cold field and look at it. It was a gypsum sculpture carved from a single block of stone, buried by a cigar merchant named George Hull, who'd had an argument about the Bible and decided to prove a point about human credulity. Here's the thing that stopped me cold when I dug deeper. The hoax was exposed almost immediately by scientists, by newspapers, by Yale's own paleontologist Othniel Marsh, who declared it a clumsy fake within weeks. The evidence was never the problem. The desire to believe was the problem. And that is where this investigation actually begins. Here is the single most important fact about giants in the archaeological record. They appear in virtually every culture on Earth, across every century of recorded history, on every inhabited continent. The Norse had the Giton. The Greeks had the Gigantes. The Hebrews wrote of the Nephilim and the Anakim. The Mesopotamians preserved stories of heroes of towering stature. Indigenous cultures across North America described great beings who walked the land before men. Polynesian mythology, West African oral tradition, Hindu cosmology. The pattern repeats, not with unsettling precision, but with the kind of distributed consistency that demands explanation. Why do giants appear everywhere? There are 3 possible explanations, and the evidence points clearly toward one of them. But to get there, we need to understand what each explanation actually claims. Explanation 1. Giants were real. Somewhere in human prehistory, a race or population of genuinely enormous humans walked the earth, left physical evidence, were encountered by our ancestors, and have since been covered up, either through the natural destruction of evidence or deliberate institutional erasure. Explanation 2. Giants are psychological. The human mind, in every culture, independently generates the archetype of something bigger and more powerful than us to explain ancient ruins, unfamiliar bones, and the gulf between human achievement and human limitation. Explanation 3. Giants are partially real. Some giant mythology was seeded by actual physical encounters, with large bones, with genuinely tall individuals, with the remains of species our ancestors couldn't identify, and those real encounters were then amplified, culturally transmitted, and transformed into mythology. The kernel was real. The legend grew around it. The deeper I looked, the more the third explanation revealed itself as the most compelling and the most interesting of the 3. Because it means the story of giants is actually a story about how human beings process evidence, how we interpret the unfamiliar, how desire shapes observation, and how a kernel of real, documented truth can become an avalanche of invented history. What's actually fascinating, more fascinating than any conspiracy, is that the truth of giant mythology contains real archaeology, real biology, real psychology, and real history. None of it requires a cover-up. All of it requires careful attention. So let's look at the actual evidence, piece by piece. Here's where it gets interesting. Long before anyone could identify a mastodon, dwarf mammoth, or Dinotherium giganteum, ancient peoples were finding enormous bones in the ground. and they were doing exactly what you'd expect intelligent people with no comparative anatomy to do. They were looking at them and saying, something big was here. The ancient Greeks, excavating on the islands of Crete, Samos, and Sicily, regularly unearthed massive skulls. These skulls had a single large central nasal cavity, a thick brow, and enormous dimensions compared to any human head. The Greek philosopher Adrienne Mayer, in her landmark 2000 study The First Fossil Hunters, documented how ancient authors describe these finds in terms that directly parallel Cyclops mythology, a single-eyed giant. The nasal cavity of a Dinotherium skull, she noted, resembles a central eye socket to any observer without knowledge of elephant anatomy. Paleontologist Othenio Abel proposed this connection as early as 1914. The National Geographic Society has since confirmed fossil elephant remains on Crete and Cyprus, exactly where Cyclops traditions are strongest. This isn't speculation. It's traceable. The bones existed. The mythology followed. These weren't invented giants. They were misread fossils. Ask yourself, if ancient people saw a 4-foot-wide skull with what looked like a single eye socket, what were they supposed to think? In 2011, the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism published a study that changed the conversation permanently. Near Fidenae, outside Rome, archaeologists excavating a 3rd century AD burial site found a complete skeleton of a man who stood approximately 6 feet 8 inches tall, 202 centimeters, at a time when Roman men averaged roughly 5 feet 5 inches. Analysis revealed hyperplastic changes to the sella turcica, the saddle-shaped bone at the base of the skull that houses the pituitary gland. The diagnosis, pituitary gigantism, a condition caused by excess growth hormone, typically due to a benign pituitary tumor. His teeth showed severe wear. His long bones showed asymmetric growth. He likely suffered chronic pain, joint problems, and reduced life expectancy, the classic pattern of untreated acromegaly. He was the tallest person confirmed from Roman antiquity. He was real. He was documented. He was scientifically verified by Dr. Simona Minozzi at the University of Pisa, and he was 6'8", remarkable, notable, exceptional, but not mythological. The disease of gigantism is real, ancient, rare, and has been documented in skeletal remains from multiple periods and cultures. A modern annual incidence of approximately 3 cases per million people means that across the full span of human civilization, thousands of individuals have existed with this condition. They would have been striking. They would have been remembered. They would have become stories. This wasn't supernatural. This was medicine. This was biology. The giant of Rome had a name no one recorded, and a tumor no one could treat. There is one chapter of the giant story that occupies a genuinely contested scientific space. Homo heidelbergensis, the archaic human species that lived between roughly 700,000 and 200,000 years ago, is documented at the Smithsonian's Human Origins Program as averaging approximately 5 feet 9 inches in males, comparable to modern humans. That's the consensus. But the story doesn't end there. Researcher Lee Berger of the University of Witwatersrand, analyzing fossil evidence from multiple sites, proposed that some regional populations of heidelbergensis may have routinely exceeded 7 feet in stature. The Bradshaw Foundation cites supporting morphological evidence. The Reddit r/anthropology community has had serious, cited debates on exactly this question. The actual peer-reviewed picture is more nuanced. A 2012 study in the Journal of Human Evolution, analyzing stature estimates from the Cima de los Huesos site in Spain, calculated a mean height of approximately 163 centimeters, about 5'4", for that particular population. Other populations showed higher estimates. The evidence is fragmented, literally. Here is what is definitely true. Early humans were more physically robust than modern Homo sapiens. Larger, heavier, more muscled. When those bones were found by people without evolutionary biology, found in fields, in caves, in river sediments, they looked, to any reasonable observer, like the bones of giants. Not because the observer was foolish, because the observer was reasoning from incomplete information. Science doesn't cover up human variation. It measures it. George Hull was a cigar manufacturer from Binghamton, New York, and he was angry about the Bible. Specifically, he was angry about a Methodist preacher named Turk, who insisted that Genesis 6:4, there were giants in the earth in those days, was literal, physical truth. Hull disagreed. But rather than argue, he decided to demonstrate something about belief. In 1868, Hull commissioned a Chicago sculptor named Edward Burghardt to carve a 10-foot 4-inch figure from a block of gypsum quarried in Fort Dodge, Iowa. The figure was deliberately aged, stained with sulfuric acid, beaten with steel needles embedded in a wooden board to simulate skin pores, and soaked in water. It was then transported by rail to the farm of Hull's cousin William Newell in Cardiff, New York, and buried 5 feet deep. In October 1869, Newell hired workers to dig a well directly over the burial site. The giant was discovered on October 16th. Within days, Yale paleontologist Othniel Marsh examined it and called it a fake. State geologist James Hall called it a fake. The New York Tribune called it a fake. The hoax lasted approximately 6 weeks before the scientific consensus was unanimous. But here is what the Cardiff giant reveals that is genuinely important. The desire to believe in giants was so strong in 1869 America that thousands of people continued paying to see it after it was publicly declared a fake. P.T. Barnum denied the right to purchase the original, simply made another one, and declared his fake to be more authentic than Hull's fake. 2 fakes, both declared fakes, both attracting paying crowds. The giant wasn't real. The need for it was. Goliath of Gath is perhaps the most culturally persistent giant in Western history, and the archaeology of Gath is genuinely fascinating, not because it confirms a 10-foot warrior, but because it reveals how ancient texts used size as narrative language. Tel es Safi, the archaeological site identified with ancient Gath, has been excavated since 1996 by Professor Aaron Mayer of Bar-Ilan University. The site contains 10th century BC material culture, consistent with a significant Philistine city, the period of the biblical David narrative. In 2005, an inscribed pottery shard was discovered with 2 names that are etymologically related to Goliath, the oldest extra-biblical mention of the name in any form. The text itself presents a measurement problem that scholars have debated for decades. The oldest manuscripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls version of Samuel, the Septuagint, describe Goliath as 4 cubits and a span tall, which calculates to approximately 6 feet 9 inches by most estimates. The later Masoretic text, which became the basis for most modern Bible translations, inflated this to 6 cubits and a span, closer to 9 feet 9 inches. Professor Jeffrey Chadwick of Brigham Young University published research in 2020 arguing that the earlier, shorter measurement is likely more historically accurate. At 6'9", Goliath would have been extraordinarily tall by Iron Age standards, legitimately remarkable, militarily intimidating, but biologically plausible. A tall, heavily armored warrior, described in hyperbolic terms by a text composed generations after the events it describes. History and legend are not the same document. Understanding the difference between them doesn't diminish either one. The most widely circulated giant claim of the Internet era involves the Smithsonian Institution, specifically, the assertion that the Smithsonian either destroyed thousands of giant human skeletons or continues to hide them in its vaults. This claim appears with remarkable consistency across YouTube channels, alternative history forums, and social media. It feels documented. It cites dates. It names institutions. Let me trace it to its origin. In November 2014, a website called World News Daily Report, which carries the disclaimer Winder assumes, all characters appearing in the articles in this website, even those based on real people, are entirely fictional, published an article claiming the Smithsonian had been ordered by the Supreme Court to release evidence of giant human skeletons. The article was satirical fiction. It included a fabricated quote attributed to a fictional Smithsonian director. Snopes investigated and rated it definitively false. Reuters fact-checkers investigated in 2022 and confirmed no Supreme Court case exists, no institutional admission exists, no physical evidence exists. The Smithsonian's own website directly addresses it under persistent myths. But the claim has continued to circulate for over a decade. Photographs that prove giant skeletons, images widely shared online, were traced by Snopes to a 2002 worth $1,000.com Photoshop contest, in which users competed to create convincing fake archaeological discoveries. The winning entry showed a giant skeleton in an excavation pit. It was made in Adobe Photoshop in approximately 2 hours. The silence in the historical record isn't deafening. The silence is empty, because there is nothing there to silence. Step back from the specifics for a moment. Now we get to the most important part. Understanding why the giant myth is so persistent and powerful tells us something profound, not about a hidden civilization, not about institutional conspiracy, but about the human mind itself, about what we need from our past, about the cognitive architecture that makes hoaxes like Cardiff not embarrassments, but symptoms. Folklorist Adrienne Mayer has spent decades tracing the relationship between fossil discoveries and mythology. Her thesis, developed across 2 books, The First Fossil Hunters, $2,000, and Fossil Legends of the First Americans, 2005, is that ancient peoples were skilled and systematic fossil collectors. They found real bones. Enormous bones. Bones of creatures genuinely far larger than any living animal they'd encountered, and they interpreted those bones using the only framework available to them: mythology, cosmology, narrative. The Greeks called mammoth bones the remains of giants. Native American tribes across the Great Plains interpreted bison fossils, mammoth teeth, and dinosaur bones as evidence of thunder beings and great serpents. Medieval Europeans, finding Pleistocene megafauna remains in caves, attributed them to dragons. These weren't errors. These were rational responses to genuinely mysterious physical evidence, filtered through the interpretive tools of the culture that found them. There is also a psychological dimension that modern researchers in cognitive science have documented extensively. Human beings are pattern recognition machines, evolved to detect agency and intention in ambiguous signals. We are deeply predisposed to believe that large, powerful beings exist beyond our ordinary perception. It is functionally adaptive, possibly hardwired into the fear response architecture that kept our ancestors alive. Psychologist Jesse Baring at the University of Queensland has researched how the sense of something larger watching over us appears cross-culturally and developmentally, even in children raised with no religious instruction. Giants are, in this framework, an externalization of that cognitive architecture. They are how the human mind makes the past feel commensurate with the present. When you stand before the pyramids, or Stonehenge, or the Easter Island Moai, and feel, in your bones, that normal humans couldn't have built this, your brain is doing something ancient and understandable. It is generating giants to fill the explanatory gap. The problem arises when we stop looking for the actual explanation and simply live inside the generated giant, when the psychological artifact gets mistaken for historical evidence, when the hoax gets treated as a cover-up. Because here is the thing that genuine archaeology reveals over and over again, with painstaking detail: ordinary humans built extraordinary things. Not giants. Not a hidden civilization. Not a lost race with technologies we can't replicate. Humans, organized, motivated, ingenious, and deeply strange, built all of it. That story, the true story, is more astonishing than any giant. The Cardiff giant didn't die in 1869. It evolved. The 19th century was, in ways that directly parallel our own moment, a golden age of manufactured sensation. Newspapers competed viciously for readers. The concept of yellow journalism, sensational, emotionally charged, accuracy-optional reporting, was being actively developed. P.T. Barnum had demonstrated that the public would pay enthusiastically to be amazed, and that the line between authentic wonder and manufactured spectacle was entirely negotiable. Into this environment, the Cardiff giant landed like a seed into perfect soil. It was visual. It was concrete. It matched a pre-existing desire, the desire for confirmation that the biblical giants were real, that America had an ancient history as deep and mythic as Europe's. It arrived at a moment when the authority of science was growing, which meant that scientific-sounding language, petrified, geological strata, ancient remains, carried increasing weight with the reading public, who lacked the tools to evaluate it. Historian Scott Tribble, in A Colossal Hoax, The Giant from Cardiff That Fooled America, 2009, traces the sociological conditions that made the Cardiff giant work: rapid urbanization, creating populations disconnected from their agrarian past, the spiritual anxieties of post-Darwin America, seeking physical proof of biblical truth, the emerging mass media economy rewarding sensation over accuracy, and a cultural appetite for the spectacular that demanded its giants be real. That 19th century media ecosystem is, in key structural ways, our own. Replace yellow journalism with algorithmic content recommendation. Replace Barnum with YouTube monetization. Replace the traveling exhibition with the viral share. The mechanism is identical, and the psychology it exploits is identical, because it is the same human brain doing the same pattern matching in a faster, louder, higher saturation information environment. The modern giant claim cycle follows a remarkably consistent pattern. It begins with a real artifact, a genuine archaeological find, a real photograph, an actual historical record that is then decontextualized. The context is stripped, and a claim is substituted for it. That claim circulates faster than any correction, because it is emotionally resonant and visually compelling. When the correction arrives, it is framed within the claim's own logic as confirmation. The institutions correcting it are the very institutions accused of covering it up. This is called a conspiracy theory self-sealing mechanism. It was first formally described by philosopher Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies, 1945, and it remains the most elegant trap in the epistemological toolkit of misinformation. Every refutation becomes evidence. Every absence of evidence becomes evidence of erasure. The claim is made unfalsifiable, and therefore, in the scientific sense, it stops being a claim at all. How do you break the seal? You do exactly what we're doing here. You go to the primary sources. You trace the claim backward to its origin. You ask not is this possible, but what is the actual evidence, and where does it actually lead? Because the evidence, followed honestly and without destination, leads to a genuinely stranger and more wonderful place than any cover-up. It leads to a Roman man with a pituitary tumor who was 8 inches taller than everyone around him and who died young and in pain. It leads to ancient Greek fossil collectors mapping mammoth skulls onto a mythology they already possessed. It leads to a cigar manufacturer from Binghamton who was so angry about a Bible argument that he buried a 10-foot gypsum man in upstate New York, and was later reportedly proud that America fell for it. These are the real giants. Stranger, more human, and more illuminating than anything invented. There is a cost to the giant myth. Not the moral cost of being deceived. Being deceived is human, ancient, unavoidable, and the people deceived by Cardiff in 1869 were not foolish. The cost is more specific. When we explain the ancient world with hidden civilizations and erased giants, we are, with the best intentions, driven by genuine wonder, removing credit from the actual humans who built it. The people who constructed the mounds of the Mississippi Valley were not a mysterious lost race. They were the Hopewell and Mississippian cultures, documented, studied with living descendants who built sophisticated trading networks, astronomical calendars, and earthworks of extraordinary precision across more than 1,000 years. Their descendants exist. Their cultures were not erased by conspiracy. They were diminished by colonialism, by deliberate cultural destruction, by the forced assimilation policies of the 19th and 20th centuries. The giant mythology of pre-Columbian North America was, in significant part, generated by colonialism, by the desire of European settlers to believe that the mounds they encountered couldn't have been built by the same indigenous peoples they were displacing. It was easier, psychologically and politically, to invent a vanished giant race than to acknowledge that thriving civilizations had been destroyed to make room for the people now standing on their monuments. That isn't ancient history. The last mound builder forced relocation happened in living memory. When the Piltdown Man hoax, a human skull combined with an orangutan jaw, planted in an English gravel pit in 1912, held sway in paleoanthropology for over 40 years, it actively distorted the field's understanding of human evolution. Real evidence from Africa, genuine fossils of genuine human ancestors, was dismissed or misinterpreted because it didn't fit the Piltdown template. The fraud had a victim, scientific progress itself. The giant myth has similar victims. Amateur archaeologists who spend decades documenting giant burial mounds are not documenting giants. They are, in some cases, disturbing actual indigenous burial sites, removing remains that belong to living communities, generating pseudo-scientific reports that cloud the archaeological record. The harm is real, physical, and ongoing. Real history, the verified, evidence-based, peer-reviewed history of our species, is not a diminished thing. It is not a consolation prize for people who couldn't find their giants. It is, if you follow it honestly, more dramatic, more strange, and more human than any mythology imposed upon it. I started this investigation asking whether giants were real. That turned out to be the wrong question, not because the answer is simply no, though for mythological giants of supernatural scale, the physical evidence firmly says no, but because the question itself is too small. It misses the more interesting terrain. The questions worth asking are, why does every culture, independently, need a giant? What does that convergence tell us about the architecture of the human mind? What does it tell us about how we process the gap between what we can build today and what we imagine our past to have been? Why did 19th century Americans need the Cardiff giant to be real badly enough that they kept paying to see it after it was proven fake? What anxieties drove that need? What does the modern persistence of the giant skeleton claim, circulating across YouTube and Facebook and TikTok, repeatedly debunked, repeatedly reshared, tell us about the anxieties driving it now? Those questions lead somewhere. They lead to real research, real papers, real debates among real scholars in folklore, cognitive science, archaeology, and media studies. They lead to Adrienne Mayer's Fossil Hunters, to Jesse Baring's work on supernatural agency, to Scott Tribble's Social History of American Hoaxes, to the ongoing archaeological work at Tel Es Safi and the mound sites of the Ohio Valley. The answers to those questions don't require a cover-up. They require attention. Here is what I believe, after following this evidence carefully. The giants are real, not as physical beings, but as a record of human cognition, as a fossilized image of how our minds work when they encounter the unfamiliar and enormous and ancient. Every giant myth is a genuine document. It documents an encounter with a real bone, a real ruin, a real person of extraordinary height, and a story the human mind built around that encounter. That story is not a lie. It is an early draft. And science, patient, imperfect, self-correcting science, is the process of revising the draft towards something closer to what actually happened, George Hull thought he was proving that people were foolish. What he actually proved was that people are desperate for wonder. The Cardiff giant told him that. Othniel Marsh and the newspaper corrections told him that wonder can coexist with accuracy. The giants we have been searching for were never buried in a field. They were always in the searching. If this investigation prompted questions, if something here pulled at you, made you want to go deeper, the sources are in the description below. Primary sources. Peer-reviewed research. Real archives. Mayers, the first fossil hunters. Tribbles, a colossal hoax. The Smithsonian's Human Origins Database. The Biblical Archaeology Society's work on Goliath and Gath. Because the deeper you go into actual evidence, the more remarkable it becomes. Not because you find hidden giants, because you find the real, strange, surprisingly wonderful truth of what humans actually were, and actually did, and actually believed, across the long span of time we've been here. That is, if anything, larger than a giant.